Okay, hi folks. We're going to be starting an information session for the Computational Media Masters and PhD at UC Santa Cruz. I'm Noah Rouen. I'm the graduate director for the department, and I'm here with
James Ryan. I'm a PhD candidate here at UC Santa Cruz.
Melanie Dickinson, also a PhD student.
Great. So the plan here is that we'll show slides and I'll talk for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions from the chat. YouTube does require you to register if you're going to ask questions in the chat. So you might want to take the opportunity to ignore what I'm saying and register for the chat, and then you can go back and watch the archived part with the slides. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be talking about the Computational Media MS and PhD. And one of the questions that we often get is, what do we even mean by this term, computational media? And it can sound like kind of a strange thing, but actually computational media is everywhere, right? When we go to the movies, we see computational media. When we use apps on our phones, we experience computational media. When we share things and communicate with each other through social media, that's computational media. When we play games, which are an increasingly important part of our social and cultural and economic life, that's computational media. And generally, these things are talked about separately, and one of the things we want to do is integrate them. But another thing is that they're talked about ahistorically, right? All these types of media came from somewhere. They build on a foundation of decades of work in universities, government labs, small companies, artist studios. And that history, we think, is really important to understanding the field and engaging with it. So in terms of thinking about computational media coming from somewhere, obviously we have to tell the technological story. But it's also, we think, really important to tell the art and design story, right? These technologies were inspired in their research by art and design questions, and it's only art and design knowledge that gives us an idea of how to use them, right? It's not that Jim Blinn decided one day that he'd really like a picture of a teapot, and then suddenly we had Monsters, Inc., right? All these things build up in an interdisciplinary way. And then there's another part of this interdisciplinary history, which is the history of trying to understand these things. And that's another part of what we want to try to integrate. This history of understanding is in part understanding how audiences experience these things. And that can draw from disciplines ranging from human-computer interaction to dramaturgy to humanities-style close reading. It's also how these forms express, right? That if we want to really understand these forms, we need to understand what's implicit within them, and therefore what they're most powerful at expressing, and also what limits they have. So we try to bring in this history of understanding both as a way of understanding our culture, which computational media increasingly informs and shapes, but also as a way of ourselves making types of computational media that that say more what we want them to say and are understood more powerfully by the people we want to reach because of the interpretive work toward understanding. Now, computational media, most of those examples I showed you were done kind of on the margins of other things, right? So MIT didn't have a lab dedicated to exploring the future of video games when Space War was created there, just like UC Santa Cruz didn't have a lab dedicated to exploring the future of video games when Rogue was created here. But now increasingly there are such things, and so part of what we see ourselves as doing is helping formulate this new field and train people for this new field that's really dedicated to pushing forward our ability to make and understand this media instead of doing it on the margins of something else. One way that we sometimes describe this to people is that it's similar to what happened when the lab sciences were brought together with computing, right? That's where bioinformatics came from, right? UC Santa Cruz is where the computational solution came from for the human genome. And it didn't come from here because computer scientists and lab biologists were kind of trying to use each other, but rather because they were coming together and saying, what are the new kinds of questions, new kinds of methods, new kinds of work that we can do if we really value the knowledge and perspective of both of these disciplines? Computational media is something similar, right? We really do value the knowledge and methods and perspectives of the arts and humanities, and we bring those together with computing, particularly computer science and human-computer interaction, to create computational media. So if that's the broader field, obviously, if you're thinking about going to graduate school, you might like to know how we address that in our curriculum. So let me talk a little bit about that. We have 3 core classes. One is basically a foundation of knowledge about the field. Where did it come from? How does it operate? The next class is a series of case studies looking at how people have done the interdisciplinary work to create computational media research projects that are successful. And then the third is trying to figure out, okay, well, how do you measure that success, right? For what kind of project would you want to use arts critique? For what kind of project would you want to see if your algorithm can be optimized to run fast enough to be interactive? For what kind of project would you want to try to look at people's social and emotional responses and see if they're the ones you were going for, or maybe if there are other ones that are opening up an unexpected territory? So hopefully between these 3 courses, everyone taking them together in a kind of cohort, people develop a foundation of understanding what we mean by computational media. In addition to the 3 core classes, there are also 3 expectations. And the idea is people satisfy these expectations before they do their major contribution of their own work in the degree. So for the master's, it'd be before the master's thesis. For the PhD, it'd be before the PhD dissertation. One is that everybody knows how to program. And if you don't know how to program, obviously there are a variety of ways to learn, but we have an agreement with the computer science program that you can take their classes. Another is that everybody knows how to make media, right? Really understanding the process of how media is made, or even different kinds of media is made, is really important for being able to make enabling technologies or interpreting how people are responding and so on, we believe. If you need background in that, one option is to take classes in the Digital Art and New Media MFA program here at UC Santa Cruz. And then we expect everyone has experience interpreting culture. And if you don't have experience with this, one option is to take courses from the History of Consciousness program here at UC Santa Cruz, which is one of the more famous programs in the world for doing this kind of cultural interpretation. Then people take topics classes. This is a selection of some of the topics classes we're offering this year. Master's students take at least 2, PhD students take at least 4. And then in terms of the general timeline, the master's can be completed in 3 to 6 quarters, right? So you could think of that as 1 year is 3 quarters, 2 years is 6 quarters, but you could do 1 year, a summer internship, come back for the fall quarter, do your master's thesis, and be done, right? Depends on what project you want to do, what your background is, and so on, how fast you would want to finish. The PhD can be completed in the same number of years that the MS takes in quarters. The PhD is obviously just a much more time-consuming undertaking, but the expectation is that you will make, again, a much bigger contribution to the field. To be done in something like 3 years, you probably need to come in already with a master's degree and already with a pretty strong idea of what your dissertation topic is going to be. Master students are generally self-supported. PhD students are generally supported by a combination of UCSC support, like TA-ships, and outside funding, like research projects. And when I say self-supported, I don't mean that there is no financial aid. I mean that the program is not responsible for making sure that your funding appears, whereas the program does try to take responsibility for making sure PhD students are funded. There's information about current fees at this URL. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time, actually quite a bit of time, talking about our faculty, because I think one of the most important things in choosing a graduate program is getting a sense of what kind of faculty support there is for different intellectual interests. And frankly, I wouldn't recommend going to a graduate program where there's only one faculty member you could imagine working with, because anything could happen to that person, right? They could be in a car accident, they could be hired away by somebody else. One of the things I'm proud of in our program is that we already have a large number of faculty focused on computational media and covering a number of areas of computational media. And we're currently this year in the process of hiring 4 more faculty. So our faculty strength will continue to grow before you show up in fall if you end up coming here. So for each faculty member, I've chosen kind of 3 projects that show some of the breadth of what they do, but they do a lot more than there's time to talk about here. So first up alphabetically is Nathan Altice, who's a media researcher who's probably best known for his platform studies book on the Nintendo Entertainment System called I Am Error. And that's, for those in games, the defining console of its generation, and had a big shaping influence on what people thought games could and should be. Moving on from that, he's actually now starting to study things that cut across generations. So for example, he's doing work on the tradition, which is particularly strong in Japan, of translating video games into board games, which again, continues to be done in the modern era and has been done through many of what we think of as the video game generations. He's also a sound artist and musician. His most recent EP is called Apple Machine Music, and he remakes 5 famous sound art pieces using the Apple Music Memos software and turning on auto accompaniment, right? So he has kind of this algorithmic addition that gets made to each of these famous sound art pieces. Angus Forbes does a variety of kinds of work. The large image here is a project of his called Time Arcs, which takes on the challenging visualization problem of showing the dynamic relationships between entities in a temporal network. And he's successfully applied this to a bunch of different things, phrases that appear together on political blogs, the IMDb co-star network, a data set showing conflicting evidence within the biomedical literature about certain protein interactions. So that's one strand of his work. He also has done work in a variety of kinds of virtual reality, including both cave and head-mounted. This project, NeuroCave, that's the top of the smaller images, allows brain researchers to interact with the connectome, which is a map of neural connections in the brain. And it can be done both on sort of standard equipment and using a VR headset. And then the small bottom image is a project of his called Poetry Chains, which does a continuous, dynamic, and interactive remapping of Emily Dickinson's poetry. And he's one of a number of people on the faculty who has investments in things like installation art and electronic literature and so on. Catherine Isbister has, like others, a variety of strands of research. The large image is the cover of her book, How Games Move Us, which grows out of research exploring and understanding the emotional impact of game design and innovating emotional experiences with games by using that knowledge. Yamove, the top smaller image, is a dance battle game that uses technology to augment face-to-face dancing. And it's part of her larger research on co-located social gameplay, and particularly building games and studying how they change social interaction and trying to find design patterns that can actually augment person-to-person interactions in the ways we desire. And then the bottom smaller image is from a Tumblr where she collected lots of images of the things people fidget with. And she's looking at fidgeting and other kinds of playful and gameful activities and how they relate to important things in the everyday world. Like, for example, fidgeting can be very important to self-regulation and concentration for kids in school, people at work, and so on. Michael John, better known as MJ around here, is a 2-decade or more veteran of the commercial game industry. His work stretches back to the original Spyro the Dragon trilogy. He's the co-creator of the Cerny method you may have heard about for game development. Before coming here, he was the game director at Glass Lab, which was a groundbreaking collaboration between people with a lot of experience making games, people with a lot of experience in the learning sciences, and some of the do-goody foundations out there that really wanted to not only explore how we could use the power of games for learning, but also how we could develop new methods for assessing that learning and even using games as a form of assessment. And right now he's the program director of our professional MS in games and playable media, which is located in Silicon Valley, hence the picture of the building. Sri Kurniawan works on a variety of ways to use computational media to help people with special needs in her group. So for example, they're developing a mobile game to reinforce the lessons of speech therapy for kids with cleft palate, because generally people's insurance or they're out of pocket can't pay for the amount of therapy that would really be useful. And something like a mobile game can not only motivate people to do it, but can also give them feedback, right? It can fulfill some of the role of the therapist. They're also working on things like virtual agents to help people who need to do rehabilitation from a stroke do their rehab work correctly. And they're also doing initial work in using virtual reality to motivate people in doing their physical therapy. And again, a variety of other projects, including things like formatting documents for the blind, which I find fascinating. Michael, Mattias, and I run a lab together called the Expressive Intelligence Studio. Here are a few projects that I'm going to associate with him. One, the sort of large boxes and arrows diagram is a visualization of some of the reasoning that's done by a system we're working on called Gemini. And what Gemini does is try to automatically interpret games. So given rules for behavior and mechanics and so on, it tries to understand how the game will feel to players and also what it will seem to be expressing about the things that are part of the game. And then it can reverse that same knowledge to generate games that have particular specifications for how we want them to feel and what we want them to be about. The smaller of the, the top of the smaller images is from his game that he created with Andrew Stern called Facade, which is sort of the first fully realized interactive drama. Part of what's interesting about this is that it takes genre conventions from theater, like beat structures and rising and falling action and so on, and operationalizes them so that the player can constantly move around and say whatever they wish to say, and yet the system still tries to give people a pleasing dramatic experience in addition to one that's responsive to what they do. And then the bottom of the smaller images is a shot from our game Prom Week that tried to take social interaction with a larger cast of characters and really make it something that people could understand and play intentionally. And both of the people who are sitting here with me in some ways could be seen as building on this tradition. So Melanie is working on the ensemble engine, which is a successor to the artificial intelligence that drove Prom Week, which we're hoping to do an open source release of. And then James is actually using a different social simulation approach to generate a foundation for storytelling that's been used for things like a game called Bad News that he might talk a little more about, or might not. We'll see how it goes. Adam Smith is an applied AI researcher, and this big image is of a project of his called Proof Doku. And what Proof Doku does is take a well-known game, Sudoku, and extend it so that players have to do things like give rationales for their moves, and in turn the artificial intelligence can actually give them intelligent hints. It's using a kind of AI approach called answer set programming, which he also used for the game Refraction, which is the smaller, the top of the smaller images. This was a game that was hand-authored to teach people about fractions. But of course, the problem is that different players have different levels of knowledge and are progressing in their knowledge at different rates in different areas. And so it really couldn't give players the right level for their particular, where they were with their zone of proximal development. So what he developed using answer set programming is a way of generating levels that were guaranteed to have certain aesthetic properties, that were guaranteed to need certain techniques in order to be solved, and that operated quickly enough that they could generate a large number of levels, and then based on where they thought a particular learner was, give them a level that was right for them. He's another one of the faculty who's interested in things like generative art and music. The bottom kind of washed out image is from his ethereal dial pad, which is a 2D touch synthesizer that's been downloaded more than 10 million times and been used for things like audience participation in a rock opera. Erin Robinson Swink is the creative director of our professional MS in games and playable media. So we have the same image of the Silicon Valley building. And she's best known for a decade of work in indie games. Probably her most famous title is Gravity Ghost, but I've also got an image there of Puzzlebots, which you may have heard of. This is me. So Noah Waterfruin does a variety of kinds of work. The large image there is the cover of my book, Expressive Processing, where I'm trying to, on one level, sort of tell the story and look at the strengths and weaknesses of different types of computational approaches to story, from the quests in role-playing games to the generative techniques in AI labs. But I'm also trying to show a way that you can interpret computational processes of any sort, not just ones that have to do with fiction, in terms of what they express through how they operate. I've also done sort of more traditional art making myself. That's the upper image of the small ones is a VR literary game called Scream, played in a room-sized display, like a cave, which we happen to have one of here. And then the bottom image is part of a larger project that James was also connected to, about trying to really move forward the whole pipeline of how we do collecting, cataloging, citing, discovering games in places like libraries and museums and in scholarly work. So this is a screenshot of GIST, which is a toolkit for trying to move toward making software states, including saved games, as citable as something like a book page or a movie time code, but also like with James, we did some really cool discovery tools where you could do things like in natural language, describe an arbitrary game, and it would try to find games that exist in the real world that are similar to it. It could just be a game you forgot. Or you could fly around in space, but that space was galaxies of related games. So again, something we might talk about later, or you could ask questions about in the chat. This is our last faculty member, our chair, Jim Whitehead. And Jim is really interested in generating things and generating all kinds of things. So they generate things for the real world, like robots, but also here, cocktails. They also work on generating things for games. So the top of the smaller image is a system that generates levels for generated games, right? How do you generate levels for a game that you don't know the mechanics of ahead of time? A pretty meaty challenge. And then the last is applying style dynamically to things. So the top images are sort of, normal Lego models, and the bottom ones have dynamically had a pirate style applied to them. So as I said before, the point of kind of marching through that faculty is to say that we support many kinds of computational media research. And I think if you have a particular kind of thing that you're interested in doing, it's worth reaching out to individual faculty who do something similar. And hopefully this kind of tour has given you a sense of who some of the people might be that's appropriate. I'm going kind of longer than I wanted to, but I do want to mention two further things. One is that this is a real picture of our real campus. I think where you do your work has a real influence on your work and on your mental health. And I just find being here in this beautiful redwood forest next to the sea with clean air and good weather just makes it easier for me to pursue the things I want to pursue. And then finally, on a drier note, the deadline is January 3rd. The GRE test is required. The application is online. There's information there. And the official curriculum is on our department page, which you could type in that whole URL, or you could probably just type in Computational Media UCSC, and you would find yourself there. Okay, so that's it for the formal presentation part. And we're going to turn off slides in a moment and start answering questions from the chat. Okay, we're ready to start answering questions from the chat. Have we had any already?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
I don't think our video. Oh, there it is.
So in that case, what I'll do is maybe ask if each of you would be willing to say a little more about your research and sort of your path to come here.
Sure.
Should I start?
Either way.
Yeah, so I am a third-year PhD student now. I came here from the undergrad computer science program. And I sort of wandered in fortuitously because the faculty here were teaching some of those computer science classes, and sort of that was my first exposure to ideas like you can apply sort of artistic things to computing. You can do both at the same time, and that just like blew my mind when I was an undergrad. So has led me down this path.
Do you want to say a little bit about what you're working on?
Sure, yeah. So I'm in the expressive intelligence studio, like all of us here. So I'm interested in applying artificial intelligence to expressive goals. Specifically, I'm working on social simulation, which is modeling social interaction, social dynamics in playable systems. Yeah, and then also looking at personalized narratives, so generating narrative after people's real lives to sort of create experiences about self-reflection and self-growth.
Great.
I'm a fifth-year PhD student. Somehow the time goes fast here. It's so fun. In computer science, I might be switching to computational media, but currently I'm computer science. I was grandfathered in prior to this lovely program existing. So there was no comp media when I was applying, but certainly I make my home in this department, and this is where I hang out. I actually came not out of computer science as an undergrad. I came out of linguistics. Growing up, I loved language. I loved art. I loved humanities, social sciences. That was the kind of stuff that I leaned more toward. But then something happened when I was about 25, which is that I learned to program. And this completely changed my life forever. I knew like I had to program. That's what I had to do. But I didn't stop loving language, art, the social sciences, the humanities. And so I ended up here. Luckily, I got into a computer science program, having no computer science courses or anything in my background. Really, I was coming to hang out with these people who had similar interests. And I've never looked back on that decision. I've never regretted that. It's one of the best decisions I've ever made. If you're anything like me and have these diverse interests that mostly come from the other side of the brain than that which is associated with computation, this is a great place to end up. As far as what I do, I work in a few different areas. Like Melanie, I'm also interested in social simulation and narrative. So my project that's most associated with those two things is a project called Talk of the Town. So this is a simulation framework that simulates an American small town for a couple centuries. And the idea is that it's simulating this town as a source of raw material that can be used in second order narrative experiences. So one of them that was alluded to earlier is a project called Bad News. So in Bad News, the setting is this town that's been generated, and then its history has been simulated for a couple hundred years. And then we do something really weird, which is that we build an installation at an art museum or a film festival or a video game festival, wherever we happen to install it. We build this installation where there's a live actor and there's a player, and that player is interacting with the live actor in a series of conversations, but those conversations are actually with virtual characters that have lived out their lives in that simulation framework. So the actor is this like cybernetic actor that is playing out a virtual character, but through like secret interfaces telling him all about his history and who this person is and their personality and so forth. That's called Bad News. You can find more information at badnewsgame.com. And I guess I could go on. I don't see any questions.
Sure.
I work in a couple other areas too. Something else I'm really interested in is the history of anything I like. And with particular, so some of the research that I do in that area is looking at the history of computational media, but also just expressive computing more broadly. So looking at video game history, the history of computational narrative and things like that. So that takes me to the days of mainframes and then sometimes to procedural stuff that even precedes the digital computer.
Yes, and also the research in discovery for video games that we talked about, and also I'm trying to remember. Oh, and also things like expressionist.
Oh, right. Yeah. So, like I said, I came out of linguistics because I loved language, and I still do. One area that I work in is the intersection of linguistics or language more broadly and computing, which is called natural language processing. And in particular, I'm interested in generating natural language for works of computational media. So things like dialogue generation for characters in games, generating stories, meaning the text of the stories. My dissertation topic is generative radio drama. So again, using that simulation framework as a source of raw material, a second order system finds interesting narratives that have happened in a simulated town and then generates a script in the style of a radio play using this natural language technology. And then I'm hoping to actually generate speech from that text. So it's all the way from simulation to audio, the style of a radio play. We'll see how far I get on that. But that's my dissertation topic. And a tool that I've developed in that area is called Expressionist. So Expressionist is a tool that's a lot like Tracery, for those that are familiar with that. But it has specific features that target it at generating text in contexts where you have simulation or world state or game state and things like that. Expressionist should be coming out pretty soon. Stay tuned, I guess. If you're interested in that, you can always ask questions in the chat too. It looks like we've got some.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so Jeff is currently a student at Seattle University in the Tech and Digital Cultures program and is wondering what type of work would you expect to see from applicants? This person is particularly looking at 2019 right now. But.
Right, so it depends a lot on the type of work that you want to do. So if, for example, you're thinking about going into the master's, our expectation is that part of what you might be doing is trying to develop new skills that you don't already have, right? We're not expecting you to already be highly accomplished, but we want to see a portfolio of work. It could be critical work, it could be technical work, it could be creative work, it could be things that mix those, that demonstrates that you really have begun to invest some time in working in areas of computational media. We'd like to see letters of recommendation from faculty if you're currently at a school, or other people that you worked with, maybe an internship or job, saying that you really do have a passion for these things, and you've shown promise as someone who would be a good match for graduate school in their experience and so on. We're looking for an essay where you talk about what you want to do in graduate school and why you might want to come here in particular. And I think these are the things that almost any graduate program would be looking for at the generic level. It's just that we're very clearly trying to be open to people who could have worked in any one of the foundational areas for computational media, whereas, like, say, a traditional digital art program or a traditional computer science program or a traditional, say, literature or cultural studies program, they're looking for people in one particular area, and they may not even be interested in you trying to integrate the others, whereas our goal is for you to bring them together. At the PhD level, we're really looking for people who are ready to hit the ground running in research. Most of the people that we accept for the PhD have already published research. Most of the people that we accept for the PhD so far, right, we've only had 1 year of computational media PhD admissions, already have a master's. And the expectation is that given that level of maturity, people already have a lot of the tools at their disposal they would need to do research. But again, depending on your research, that might be different. Someone who's coming in thinking they're going to do human-computer interaction research may not already know how to program, whereas somebody who's doing, say, more technical research in generative methods or visualization or interactive narrative, presumably knowing how to program, whether they're self-taught like James or whether they've been through a computer science program like Melanie, is already in their toolkit. So I guess one of the important things in terms of applying is articulating what you want to do, who you imagine doing it with, and what the foundation is that you're working from at the PhD level. Whereas again, at the master's level, building that foundation might be one of your aspirations. Anything either of you would want to say about the experience of being a prospective student or conversations you've had with prospective students?
Yeah, I would say if you think you aren't qualified, you may actually be. Like I said, I didn't have a computer science degree, and I was trying to apply to a computer science program, which means I was skipping like N years of coursework that I was supposed to have. I really thought there was no chance that I would get in. But what I did was I actually reached out to faculty beforehand and emailed them. And I said, look, this is my story. I don't have the degree that I'm supposed to have to even enter this program, but I have these interests, I have these skills. Here's what I would want to do. I think that's a critical component of an email to a faculty member beforehand. So I'd say reach out if you don't think you're qualified. You may, in fact, totally be. And generally, I think it's a good thing to set up a prospective relationship with someone you'd want to work with beforehand, because that should really be what's driving the application. Like Noah said, there should be one or ideally more people that you'd like to work with at the place you're applying. It's not about the program, it's about who's going to be your faculty, what's your lab life going to be like, what kind of research can you do?
I would echo that. Reaching out to people beforehand, also students, even current students, is really helpful.
If people want to reach out to you two, what would be the best method?
Email, probably.
My website is jamesryan.world, and it's easy to find out how to contact on there. But email, Twitter, DM, whatever's. I have my methods on there. Preferably not LinkedIn, preferably an email. Or something, you can do it as well.
Cool. And real quick, we have another interesting question. You mentioned the history of computational science. How extensive is that timeline? I think that's an appropriate question for this group.
Yeah, maybe we should start with James.
Well, who mentioned because you were talking about, and you were talking the history of computational biology, essentially, right?
Oh, right. But I was, and I was, as an analogy to computational media, right? I was saying these everyday experiences of computational media are built on a foundation.
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay. Should we presume that?
Yeah.
Okay. It goes back really far. So, when you say, I'll talk about the history of computational media. The history of computational science. I think you end up on Plato in most histories. But the history of computational media, right away when the computer comes in the late 40s, the electronic general purpose digital computer, you shortly thereafter, and maybe right away, but we don't know yet, you find computational art. So Noah's actually written this really lovely paper on the earliest known computational art project, which is Christopher Strachey's 1952 love letter generator. So he was using the Manchester United computer in England, this behemoth mainframe. I don't know if you looked into this, but the cost per hour of using that machine, in today's money, it was like $12,000 an hour or something like that. So I think he was probably working on this at night, but it's a computer program that generates love letters. Alan Turing may have been a collaborator, was certainly involved in some regards. It was actually enabled by Turing's random number generator, which was a cool early utility program. So right away, like maybe that project costs $200,000 or something like that, right, in today's money. So right away when the mainframe hits, you have computational media. But actually, even as the general purpose digital computer is being envisioned by Charles Babbage with his analytical engine, a year after he publishes his initial design for that, Ada Lovelace is writing about the prospect of using this machine to generate music. So the idea was there always from the beginning of the idea of the general purpose digital computer. I bet that this kind of procedural media is as old as the procedure, which there's a prehistory, I'm sure, that we can never reach, that is procedural generation and procedural media.
Awesome.
So if we don't have another question, it struck me that one thing that might interest people that I don't think we did talk about in the
Back.
Okay, I think we might be back.
Okay, some delay. Okay, great.
All right.
All right. So,
Yay.
First of all, Jeff, thanks for the nice message. I totally encourage you to apply. Feel free to DM me on Twitter if you have any additional questions. And then maybe you were cut off before.
oh, I was just asking if each of you could say a little bit of something about you. You live both as close as you could and as far as you could from campus. So maybe that would be
I could
informative
live
for
like
people to hear
in
about.
my cube.
That's true.
Yeah, so I was saying I live over the hill, we say, in San Jose. I commute every day. I take one of the university van pools here, which is actually really nice as a kind of a wake up and sort of kind of mellow out time, because I don't have to drive. I can just hang out and read or whatnot. But yeah, it's like maybe slightly cheaper over there. It's definitely more available housing, in that it's a big city, lots of amenities, better food. But it is pretty good here too.
Yeah, I live in what's called family student housing here. So to qualify for family student housing, you need to qualify to satisfy this legal notion of a family unit, which could be a spouse, a partner, a sibling, a parent. There's guidelines that you can find online, but it's more lenient than you might expect from the name of it. And family student housing is on campus, and it's about, if you were driving, it's about a 3-minute drive to where we stand today, which is my office is just down the hall. So yeah, I'm about as close as you could get without sleeping in my cubicle. And it's very convenient. There's a clear trade-off between all the great amenities that Melanie just mentioned, living in a city, or even if I lived in town in Santa Cruz, town meaning, so the campus is up kind of perched 1,000 feet above sea level on a hill, and town is right on the coast, so right at sea level. We're about, 10-minute drive or something. So we're very close, but living on campus is very convenient. But if I want to go to a restaurant or go get groceries or anything like that, I have to drive. And the price is also cheaper in family student housing. It's subsidized. So yeah, I would say a convenience trade-off. I actually like probably amenities more than I like convenience, but I was moving from out of state and I didn't want to remotely rent a place without looking at it. And I didn't want to fly out just to look. And so I knew like if I got campus housing, I could trust it to be viable. And then once we got in, we actually have an ocean view in our apartment. We just happened to, there's a few that peek out through the trees. And so we liked it and we never moved after.
Yeah, and I've lived in town many times in different spots as I did my undergrad here. And I would recommend it more than commuting from San Jose if possible. But if you have, say, a partner who's working in the Valley, that's often what people do is sort of try to find as middle spot as possible, and both folks commute. And it's very doable. But in town, if you're looking and you're sort of unsure where to go, definitely reach out to a current student, because lots of folks have a lot of opinions about like where to go, lots of advice, what neighborhoods are maybe better than others, or closer to like bus routes to campus and stuff.
There are houses in town that have for generations of graduate students been occupied by multiple graduate students, and if you get in touch with people, you might be able to find a spot opening up in one of those.
Exactly. Yes, and that might also be a good way to get connected to down the line, of course, with other maybe incoming students, so that you can get in on a house together, which is what most people do with places around here. There are a lot fewer sort of single apartments, and it's often a lot cheaper to go in with housemates, and that's also a really nice way to build some connections. I really love doing that quite a bit.
And you may have heard horror stories about campus housing, various places. Like I lived on campus when I was a graduate student, and a mushroom literally grew right above my bed. I've not heard any of those stories here. I don't know. No, okay. Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, that kind of sounds magical.
if it weren't for the leaky, musty ceiling, that it made that possible. Yes.
In Providence.
Yeah, in Providence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
An institution that shall not be named. No, I'm just kidding. I had a great experience in graduate school. I encourage you to go to my alma mater as much as I encourage you to go here. Just don't live in campus housing. Do we have any further questions?
No.
Okay. well, maybe what we ought to do is turn towards other things you think would be useful for people to know who might be watching this archived.
Right.
Okay.
I have something that I always wish I could tell people who like come in, like as if I sort of could go back in time and tell them, like, if you're at all uncertain whether you want to do a PhD or master's, like any uncertainty, go for the PhD, because it's better supported, and it's easier to sort of not sort of recommended necessarily, but it's a lot more doable to sort of leave after you kind of pick up a master's along the way and go into industry or whatnot. If you come in as a PhD rather than sort of the opposite, come in as a master's and then decide to switch to a PhD. Yeah, I would you guys agree with that? Or?
I don't know. Noah would feel, he might feel differently.
Well, I guess it depends, right?
I totally agree as a student. I
Right.
think that's great advice.
Yeah, I think the bar to being accepted as a
Right.
PhD student is higher, right? So I know some people who are worried maybe their application isn't strong enough yet, feel like they should hedge their bets and apply to a master's. I think that's one of those things where it's really worth reaching out to potential advisors, because as James said, their evaluation of your strengths may not match yours, right? It's often very hard for us to evaluate ourselves, especially from the perspective of someone we don't know well.
Right.
So yes, there are advantages to the master's and PhD as degrees, right? Much lower opportunity cost if you just want to get a master's to get a master's. But yeah, if what you really want is a PhD and you're just worried about whether your application is strong enough, that's a good time to talk to people.
Something that came to mind, but I don't think either of us actually have experience with this, maybe you do and I'm forgetting something, is there's a lot of internship opportunities being this close to Silicon Valley. So I know probably half of our lab or more has done at least one internship and or paid summer or whatever, working with cool tech companies in the proximity. So that's just a unique opportunity. This is one of the closest universities to Silicon Valley, and there's just so much happening there, especially if you're interested in artificial intelligence and things like that, which I assume lots of folks interested in this program would be.
And there are other ways that people produce additional money, right? So like, I know you've done consulting for an AI startup. I hope that's okay to say. I know you've taught in summer school over at Stanford. Presumably that's okay for me to say, right? Yeah. So being both in the physical location where we are and being located in the intersection of fields where we are produce opportunities for students that aren't necessarily available in other places.
Sort of coincidental with that proximity to cool tech stuff is the proximity to 3 major cities, which is San Jose is about a 45-minute drive, San Francisco is about an hour and a half, and then Oakland's 15 minutes longer than that. So this is not a campus that's in a big city, but there's big cities that are totally within driving distance. So you can have your cool city amenities like Melanie gets every day, just a short drive away. And then in addition to just cool cities in the area is the just like multitude of amazing weekend trips you can take just being in on the central coast of California. So Lake Tahoe is a 4-hour drive. LA is 6 hours, San Diego's 8 hours, Tijuana's 8.5 hours. San Francisco and Oakland, of course, the Bay Area is right there. Wine country is 3 hours or something like that. There's just like so many cool things. You can go on a mountain and see snow. You can go have amazing wine. You can go to LA, all in a day's trip, which really I think is pretty special about this particular area.
And one thing that is maybe not immediately obvious looking at the map is one way to get to San Francisco is just to drive up the coast. And it's not really slower than going through the main, driving arteries that are more in the middle of the peninsula, because often there's a little bit of traffic there, and it's very dependable that that there's not much traffic going up the coast, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
So like Robin Hunicke, who's a faculty member here, she has a game studio, Phenomena, up in San Francisco. And at least last I talked to her, she always did that commute driving up and down the coast because, you know, it's just a wonderful thing to do with your day instead of a horrible commute that you have to get through.
Yeah. Pacific Coast Highway. It's a slice of maybe the most famous drive in the world, and certainly in America.
We have another interesting one from Leo. To what extent do you look at analog media within a computational context?
It's a great question.
Yes. So this is something that I should say more often than I do, right? But for example, I consider the board games that Nathan Altice studies to be computational media, right? In different ways and to different extents, right? Some of them, you know, like the Donkey Kong game that just has like a barrel you can throw. You know, maybe what it's doing is using a physical world analog for what would otherwise be a physics engine, right? But most board games have counters and tokens and all these things that you're using basically as a physical computer, right? So I guess I'd say I'm interested in media that use computational processes, and many famous types of media that use computational processes either have a physical component, like Bad News, or are entirely physical, like board games. And I guess I'd say among the faculty and students, the interests are considerably broader, right? Like I would say it probably doesn't make so much sense to think about something like LARPing as computational media, right? It's probably a combination of gameplay and performance. But there's definitely like a strong thread of interest in things like, LARPing is live action role playing, in other kinds of, you know, embodied play, both in the computational media program and in other parts of campus, right? Where we have faculty like Elizabeth Swenson or Susanna Ruiz or others who really have an investment in some of those kinds of physical play.
And I would say even if even if you wouldn't consider some kind of analog media computational media, it might still be of interest to you and other faculty. So like John Mahorter comes to mind. He was an MFA, he's an MFA graduate from about 2 or 3 years ago. And his MFA thesis was on creating physical games, and like creating sports and different kinds of games. And that's, no one's going to say that's computational media, but I think everyone was interested in it.
And his advisors were in this department.
Exactly. Me personally, one thing I'm really interested in is text generation and narrative generation. And because like I mentioned, I'm interested in the history of these areas. That takes me back to before the computer and before computation to like text generation methods where they would throw dice to generate, or cut up, or middle age, like discs, what's the word? Concentric circles that are each a disc, and you can create different text like that. And then story generators that don't use computation. They're totally analog, but are still, they're part of a lineage that culminates in computational media later.
Is that our last question so far?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we have, I guess, about 3 minutes left. We could obviously end early, but is there any last thing that either of you would want to say to people who are thinking about going to graduate school?
Yeah, this was the best thing I've ever done too. I think that's what you said earlier, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And even when I've sort of like, you know, stumbled and made mistakes, it's still been the most like sort of self-affirming thing. Like feel like I have so much agency to kind of determine my life and sort of make an impact on the world here. That yeah, I would really highly recommend it.
I totally echo that. And then 2 things that I think I'll end with. One is that having this just like amazing faculty group here, and then within each individual, such a bevy of interests, you have so much freedom to explore things that you think are cool. Because there's a very high chance that if you're interested in this program, all of the things you think are cool will probably, you'll have other, there'll be faculty here who think those things are cool too and worthy of research. So I've just had a chance to work in like dozens of different subfields. And each time I've had top tier mentorship in whatever area that is in, and also the encouragement to explore those areas and so forth. I can't imagine there's many research labs or departments in the country or in the world where you could do the variety of things that I've done and have it be considered research, and you go to conferences and present it and so forth. Another thing is that in addition to the amazing faculty group, there's a really amazing student group here. So how many faculty are we at currently?
I think we have 9. I think that's right.
Yeah. Nine faculty, each with at least a handful of students. Some labs have, double-digit students. There's probably, I don't know, 50 to 75 of us students, like in this, maybe 35 to 50 or something.
40-ish,
There's 40-ish, which is a lot.
Yeah.
So there's just a huge amount of students that also share your interests, that can be collaborators, people you can just bounce ideas off of, and just provide like this awesome community to be a student in.
Yeah, maybe I'll end on the same note and just say, I think graduate school is a really great experience if you love intellectual and creative life in lots of different places, but it can be lonely too. And I think I'm really personally happy that we've created such a vibrant community here where frankly, people sometimes have to take a step back from being engaged all the time in the ongoing, exciting intellectual and artistic and technical conversations. It's just such a contrast from what I experienced, and but I think a very positive one for people and their work. Most of the students I work with, I am together with at least 3 times a week, and so for me, it's kind of like being at a conference all the time. I'm constantly hearing all these really cool ideas and updates on all these great projects, and I feel really lucky to be here, and I hope that we've answered the questions that you have. And if not, feel free to be in touch with any of us.
Come join us. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.